shall we get started? I think a couple other people are going to be coming in that maybe are still wondering. So thank you so much to everyone for coming into the Tech and Technology program for sponsoring this talk called The Slender Man, the Uncanny Lure of a Digital Campfire. And today we have Dr. Shira and Dr. Eric Newsom. And Shira is assistant professor in mass media arts at the University of Georgia. And Eric Newsom is assistant professor in communication at the University of Central Missouri. And so what Shira studies is this, as well as games, gender and identity. And Eric Newsom has an interest in digital storytelling, which extends to both research and creative endeavors. So he co-publishes a web series, a web comic called Lady Saber and the Pirates of the Ineffable Ether. And they're going to talk today about the legend of Slender Man, the creation of this legend, which is a really fascinating example of the way that digital culture and digital narrative really intertwine, so that a group of co-creators can interact and collaborate online in order to create a story, which really has roots and connections to folklore practices, but spreads and is refined through digital media. So it's a really fascinating study. And the second reason that I was so happy they were able to come and talk to us is because this particular book that they'll be talking about, their research from, was published as part of the Palgrave Pivot series, which is a new open access initiative, publishing initiative. And it's a way for scholars to get their scholarship out there a little bit quicker. And given the topic of their study, there may be reasons for that and wanting to do that. And also because that particular initiative engages with the open access kind of ethos and conversations that we've been having in tech and technology. So they'll be talking also about the process really of creating this and how they worked with that particular publishing initiative and collaborated across states in order to create this work. So I'm really looking forward to hearing their talk, and welcome Shira and Eric.
So thank you all for bringing this out here. Some of you may notice this, but Shira actually went through a doctoral program at Rensselaer Polytechnic in upstate New York, and this is actually the first time we've seen each other in 5 years. We was at the airport yesterday, so you've kind of helped bring us back together after we wrote this book. And we've each actually applied to UCF in the past. You were one of my last two options for the doctoral program today. So we were interested to come and see what your program and what your campus is about. We wrote, this past summer, we co-authored a book called Folklore Horror Stories and the Slender Man, the Development of an Internet Mythology. We're not going to be talking about everything from the book today, but we're going to talk about what the Slender Man is, how it happened, how different places online that we refer to as digital campfires interpret the story in dramatically different ways, and how all of this reminds us what can happen when we make transmedia, which is storytelling occurring over multiple forms of media. And additionally, we do want to share with you the process of our writing this book, this sort of impetus behind our coming together to write it, to co-author it, and what our collaborative process was, what our publishing process was, what our experiences were with collaboration. So, does anybody know the news story that we're talking about that happened last summer, the Slender Man case? Can anybody tell me some of the details that you know about it?
Teenagers come with their friends and said something they do.
It's a little bit like that. It was two 12-year-old girls lured a third away after a slumber party that they had held at one of the girls' houses to a wooded park area nearby, and this was in Waukesha, Wisconsin. And there they had premeditated her murder. They stabbed her 17 times, I believe, with a kitchen knife, and left her to die in the woods. She actually crawled bleeding out of the woods and was able to find help and was hospitalized and is now okay. So there's that positive sort of note on the end of that story. And when this happened, it sort of threw, because when the police found them, they were wandering down the interstate in Wisconsin, and when they were arrested, they were brought in for questioning. And they both sort of attributed the stabbing to the Slender Man, this character that they had heard about on the internet and they said that they had planned to act as proxies in his name to perpetrate this killing and to go off to live with him at his mansion in the woods, which is where they were ostensibly on their way to at the time that the police picked them up. And this really threw this sort of confession threw the Slender Man story into the national spotlight. And we found journalists sort of going and saying, well, what is this weird thing that's happened? And put yourself in the position of these journalists. You've never heard of the Slender Man character, and then you go online to do your research for this news story and find hundreds of thousands of pages of writing and videos and blog entries and social media accounts and all manner of creations related to this thing that before these two girls sort of broke this national story, you had no idea existed. So there was this concept that there was this evil sort of thing that had been there all along that they hadn't noticed before, which is interesting because that sort of folds back into the idea of the Slender Man mythos as well. And so early on we had these news stories sort of ascribing agency to this fictional folkloric character. Agencies that actually honestly should have known better. CBS News said prosecutors, the mythological tale drove these 12-year-old girls to stab their friend. The tale drove them to stab their friend. Mashable, which is an online magazine, said that called it the Slender Man, the fictional creature that drove two young girls to stab their friend. And the Washington Post referred to Slender Man as the internet meme that compelled two 12-year-old girls to stab their friend. All these things sort of buy into the confession of the girls, that it was attributable to this omnipresent evil being online. The news reporters were giving agency to the creature. But quickly they went on from there to also ascribe blame to the people who had told the stories in the first place. So the National Enquirer, who we expect hyperbole from, referred to Slender Man writers as a school for ghoulish murderers on the internet. But here's an actual publication. You can see calling the Slender Man storytellers an internet horror cult that almost caused the killing. And we have Jack Russell from the Waukesha police chief. Not Jack Russell. Russell Jack, got it backwards. Not the terrier, but the police chief. Russell Jack, talking about the dark things that exist on the internet, sort of building this idea of there's a certain evil that's taking place. Other folks like Miguel Montero at CNN likened Slender Man storytellers to child molesters. And Dr. Keith Blow, a psychologist consultant for Fox Friends, said that the Slender Man story should carry a Surgeon General's warning, and that the people who wrote these stories should know that they were inspiring murderous practices in people just by virtue of their telling of stories. And so all of these media outlets were quick to jump to this moral panic mode to seek to vilify the people who were telling these stories, people that ran the sites that hosted them, people that participated in the process of distributing these sites. There were warnings to parents: don't let your kids, find out if your kids know about the Slender Man, and then you need to have a talk with them, which is not necessarily untrue, but not to the degree that the media was sort of fear-mongering in this situation. For example, here's a report from Nancy Grace.
With me right now, Shira, the assistant professor of mass media arts, University of Georgia, a Slender Man scholar. Yes, there is actually a scholar on Slender Man. Shira, thank you for being with us. What's so incredible to me is, these pictures look so real, Shira, and when children look at this, they think Slender Man is real. Now, the creator of Slender Man has said, basically, wow, I'm so sorry this happened. What do you think is going to happen when the whole myth is to live with Slender Man in his mansion, you've got to kill somebody?
That's not actually the original myth, and I think part of the problem that's happening here is that we're seeing something that has been internalized and then reinterpreted by these young girls. The original Slender Man stories, as they appeared initially on somethingawful.com and then later went up the web, but also creepypasta, as you noted, they're no more dangerous than a vampire story. It's the same sort of thing. And part of the problem here is that they took something out of context and they put their own
about Slender Man? It did not involve a proxy of any sort or a mansion?
No, it does not talk about any sort of mansion. In fact, Slender Man lives in the woods.
So that's the Nancy Grace take on it. You can see there's some interesting things sort of happening there in that conversation between Nancy and Shira. One, we can see that the reporters are sort of struggling to understand this unknown thing. Previously, when we had moral panics, there were people that we could ascribe them to, right? Judas Priest makes music, we can bring them to court and look them in the eye and say this. But when we're talking about Slender Man, we're talking about a mythos that thousands of people have participated in the creation of. And the second thing was there were details that came out in the story, in the girl's confession, that didn't quite make sense with even what we as researchers of this material had encountered before. So at first we had no idea. Where is this mansion story sort of coming from? We've not encountered him living in a mansion. And so when we're starting this process of doing this research, we're looking at a couple of things. We're seeing the works of people that we've previously studied and had interest in as digital storytellers, sort of being vilified and demonized in the news. And so we thought it was important to give this side of that sort of being the benefits of the creative process and the astounding things that we see as part of that creative process. But we're also, interested also in seeing where did this mansion thing, sort of tracing that through. And that took us on interesting journeys in our research as well. And so we wanted to look at how this happened. We wanted to look at the process of story generation. We wanted to look at the processes that people went through to create and distribute these stories online. And we also wanted to sort of acknowledge that these stories were powerful enough for these girls to feel this effect, to be inspired to do things in reality that were caused by sort of that they believed in because of these fictional stories. So there was a power to these stories that we also wanted to look at.
So it all started with something awful. So first of all, before I even get to this, who in here has heard of the Slender Man before today? Other than the advocates? Okay. Who knew about it before the incident in Wisconsin? Okay. So I just kind of like to gauge where we're all coming from. So it all started with something awful. Have any of you been to somethingawful.com? It's an older website. It's a precursor to 4chan and Reddit. In fact, the creator of 4chan specifically said, like, this was one of his influences. He was a frequent poster on Something Awful before he created 4chan. And it's a very irreverent site. It's primarily forum-based, and it's a pretty irreverent site, which you can tell from the image of the hand grenade next to their logo and their slogan, which is "The Internet Makes You Stupid." So that gives you a sense of it. But one of the things that they're really well known for is image generation and manipulation contests. And when I say contest, I mean that word is meant very loosely. Contest for bragging rights. They refer to it as Photoshop Friday, and every Friday they put out a challenge and they say make this kind of an image. So, for example, this is Jerk Superheroes. Somebody made that image for the Jerk Superheroes contest at one point. And when I say, again, contest very loosely, more of a contest for bragging rights than for crimes, right? Here's another Jerk Superhero moment, Catwoman missing the litter box. Not a Photoshop contest, but another forum. So this is part of kind of the culture of Something Awful, and somebody created a thread just kind of randomly one day on a user named Gregor or something like that. It's something crazy that I could never possibly pronounce. Started a new thread called Create Paranormal Images. This was in May of 2009, and for the first day and a half, the images that came from that were what you would pretty much expect. There were a bunch of orbs, there were a lot of orbs, and a lot of sort of shadowy, ghostly images. There was one of like a faceless doll that, just like nothing too spectacular, what you'd expect from Create Paranormal Images, but people were having a little bit of fun with it. And then about a day and a half in, a user that went by the name Victor Surge, later identified as a man named Eric Newsom, he wrote an entry, and it was 2 paragraphs and 2 photos. And so the entry, the text in the entry, we didn't want to go We didn't want to kill them, but its persistent silence and outstretched arms horrified us and comforted us at the same time. And then it says this is one of two recovered photos from the Sterling City Library blaze taken the day of a fire where 14 children vanished for what is referred to, and also for what is referred to as a Slender Man. And that's it. That's the entire canon of this story. So when you think about like the canon of Star Trek, you're talking about something really vast, right? This is the canon. This is the first photo. And one of the things you'll notice is that does everyone see Slender Man in that? Yeah. All right. So he's always just in the background. He's never specifically interacting with the people for the most part, and there are exceptions, and we'll talk about those exceptions later on. But he's a stalker, he's a lurker. He's not active, he's never involved, he's just observing. And so this is the second one, which is obviously a lot more ominous. And everyone sees the Slender Man, that one. Sometimes you have to ask, because, but the forums went nuts. They went crazy for this, because this was something completely different. This was better than orbs, right? And so everybody was posting images. Everybody got into it. And what started off as a create paranormal images thread very rapidly turned into a Slender Man thread just with the same type. And so it became sort of a Where's Waldo game in a lot of these. Does someone see Slender Man in this? No. Right there. And some people, everybody did it a little differently. Some people posted it with the source images, and some people, like every so often there were people that like wrote charts because some of the images were like impossible to find in a coherent way. Like, it was like it became harder and harder to see the Slender Man in half of these images, in part because often the Slender Man was disguised by trees, because if you have to disguise a tall, slender man, then trees are the way to go. And a tall, slender man with suits are in black and white photo. This one, there are like several places where there could be a Slender Man in that one. I've never, which is why I'm kind of showing this one, is like this is one of the original photos, and you have to like look really hard and use your imagination for this one. But what was cool was that the genre and the parameters were being negotiated very rapidly on the fly, and that was something that like immediately caught my eye with all of this, was that it was, when you have something like an oral folk legend that happened hundreds of years ago, there were negotiations, right? So like, say, for a vampire, there might be, there are all kinds of variations of what you could construct as vampire, right? There would be, turns into a bat, turns into dust, can't go into the daylight, turns, gets sparkly when he goes into the daylight. All kinds of things that, and if you have a certain subset of those things, you can say, that is a vampire, right? And you were getting that happening with this Slender Man, but the difference is that rather than being dispersed geographically and chronologically, it was happening really, really fast. This negotiation was like crazy fast. And like people knew they were doing this and were making comments to the effect of, I get that we just created this, but I'm terrified. One person I remember said something to the effect of, I am now terrified of trees and tall people. And so there was a lot of short fiction. People started, so this is hieroglyphics that somebody made. So suddenly people were starting to, this shows an example of people starting to move the character backwards in time, right? He's always been there, he'll always be there. So suddenly they're like playing with history in these really weird ways. And so a lot of them took on German or Eastern European spin. So this is Der Ritter image modified from a woodcut. And again, putting him backwards into history. Another Eastern European one, this is Der Grossman. And so we have suddenly this strange historicity that is anachronistic, but not exactly, right? A child drawing. This is all from the original form. This is not like any recent iterations. This is original stuff. And then you start getting the beginnings of some of the absurd stuff at this point. And so, okay, at this point, let's make a list. What are all of the, as I said, like vampire has a certain subset, right? So what are the possible attributes of the Slender Man at this point, during this moment of development? What are some things that that seem to either be consistent in every image of him, or at least in some?
Tall, thin, faceless.
Tall, thin, faceless, yes. So yeah, he always wears a suit. I guess what?
Yeah, lots of limbs.
Yeah, lots of either many limbs or extraordinarily long arms, right? So one or the other, and again, that's part of that negotiation process, right? Like sometimes it's like, hey, you know,
Yes.
let's just give them all these. And I remember there was one comment that somebody was like, I hate to sound all hentai, but perfect, that won't hurt tentacles. So I mean, like the people can be very playful with the whole thing, and so you know, also always a man, pretty much always a man. And so there was this kid, you know, sometimes he wore a hat, sometimes he was bald. So there were certain things that were being negotiated. The tentacles versus arms was really the biggest fight of those original forms. Okay, but who was it? I don't know if anyone picked up on this yet, but who is he most interested in? Children, right? He is interested in children. He steals away children. And so, and you even get some like sense of like fairy lore in that, right? Almost like changelings. So, a shift began with the web series Marble Hornets, which was several weeks after the first post from Victor Surge by a user that went by the name Survivors. And he started posting on the forums, and he didn't explicitly say that it was Slender Man, like on the same Create Paranormal Images forum, and linking to a YouTube channel. He didn't say it was explicitly Slender Man, but it very clearly was. So I'm going to show you the first two videos of this. They're very short. Is entry number 1. So, and it's revealed eventually, that's all the Marble Hornets will watch, but it's revealed eventually that the glitching and audio removal is because Slender Man affects recordings. And we also learned pretty rapidly that Alex is not just filming Marble Hornets, but actually himself all the time, non-stop, like he's just filming himself. He keeps a camera running. So, Marble Hornets was kind of, I would say, not a hit even by YouTube standards, but certainly at the time period a hit by YouTube. In 2009, there weren't a lot of hits on YouTube, right? So people were interested, so they continued going. They they were getting marginally successful, and I would say within about a year, in response to Marble Hornets, there were several other series of varying quality that began as sort of fan tributes to Marble Hornets with their own stockings, and they really identified themselves as fans of Marble Hornets, but then they ended up getting sort of their own following, right? Like people started getting interested in them. So one of them was Tribe 12, which followed this sullen-looking gentleman right over here, who his nosebleed is due to the Slender Man, because whenever this started this new thing called Slender Sickness. So they would cough violently, they get nosebleeds, whatever, when the Slender Man's around. And so mostly the series was Noah ranting nonstop and complaining that the Slender Man won't leave you. Why would you just leave me alone? That's my impression of Noah in the entire series. And so at one point he did like a 45-minute drunk live stream of him complaining. It was really epic. And so, but the whole thing is that he tried to uncover what happened to his cousin Milo. And this is a trailer that they made, and I just want to show a little bit of it, not much, just to give you a sense of the production values, which started shifting. It went from like tape glitching to significantly higher production values at this point. Cheesy, but better. So of course this is still college student aesthetics, but different from what Marble Hornets was doing. I'm gonna stop it there. You get an idea of it. So another one was Everyman Hybrid, which started off pretending to be a fitness video log, and then they had a Joe Slender Man background in one, and the real thing started stalking them. Oh no! And so they, once again, it was a group of primarily white dudes freaking out over being stalked over the Slender Man. Not much actually happening, just a lot of stalking. I should say that Tribe 12 has some of the most adorable depictions of a Slender Man cult that you could ever imagine. It's like their idea of what a cult looks like is just really, really sweet. And there was communication and guest appearances between several of these shows. And except for Marble Hornets, Marble Hornets wouldn't even watch anyone else's show. They were above all of that. They were like, no. You all talk amongst yourselves. We're doing our thing. But Everyman Hybrid, Tribe 12, and another one called Dark Harvest all had guest appearances on one another's shows. And this is the symbol for the operator. We start with Marble Hornets. So the web series began to shift the storytelling. There were a bunch of new attributes that we've listed. What are some of the new attributes that beyond what we had started with? So audio, video glitching, and problems with audio, video, fix that. What else? The sickness. Anything else you notice that's different? Uncannily, the Slender Man has moved on from being interested in small children and is now exclusively interested in white dudes that happen to be film students. So that was a thing that began to happen over the course of it. And they were always jobless, right? All these dudes that had nothing else to do other than film themselves all day long. So somehow the Slender Man, as Eric and I were writing, but one of our running jokes was, how did they know that the Slender Man wasn't just offering them jobs? But if you're jobless and a dude in a suit comes over to you, faceless or not, you should be like, sure, I'll think about it. And then there began to be a migration at this point. Also, it started developing into, so the video game Slender Man Pages became popular. That was a video game developed off of it, and because it was a free video game, it became very popular with younger audiences. So specifically, a tween audience, which is now about college age, was sort of the primary audience. And if you go onto YouTube, you can find a bunch of videos of people playing the Slender game, freaking out because it's really scary. And so there was Slender Man Pages, and then a sequel to that. And then Minecraft had a character into Enderman. And so as this migration occurred in different places, each of these different places interpreted the character very differently. And the meme development in this case also began to take the form of parody. So we start seeing like a bunch of Slender Man parodies popping up around this time. This is, I won't show you all of it, but this is a short video called Slender Man is a Crappy Roommate.
Boy, oh boy, what a rough day at work. Fish and crackers, Garrison. You just wrecked my day. It was about Godzilla eating a panda. If you think that's bad, wait till you hear about my day. Your day? What happened during your day? Well, see, this bird flies in from out underneath. And what the hell is going on? Well, listen. God damn it. Slender Man! This is our allotted time that we said we would be filming every week. And all you have to do is stay in your room. Go back to your closet. You can come out and do whatever freaky.
So you get the idea. And then you get Slender Man's more fashionable brother. There's a meme for Trender Man, which was making fun of the fact that mannequins are usually faceless. Another Trender Man. And then one of my favorites, and I won't spoil it, I'll just show.
Imagine if we saw hot air balloon.
That would be so cool.
Like, maybe let's not make that comment with it.
Oh, we can only hope.
Let's keep watching.
Yep.
Is it weird?
Yeah, that's a little strange. Do you think something?
It's Slender Man! Thank you, Slender Man!
So, Slender Man's other roommate became, and so this became sort of a running gag, right? And playing along with the idea of the production values and all the other things, but the idea of the glitching and everything, but pulling that into the parody. And also, this is the what's referred to as the $20 meme. So one of the episodes being put to Ron Perez, $20. So using Marble Hornets footage and then. So the joke of this one was basically that all Slender Man actually wanted was $20. If you give him $20, he will go away. Which I believe became a running joke with the Enderman thing in Minecraft at some point, that there's a way to like get rid of the Enderman with $20. But I'm not a Minecraft player, so I'm not entirely sure. And Eric, this is you.
Okay, so that's sort of how the initial, I want to say Slender Man story, that's how the initial Slender Man myth started growing and spreading. But I want to pull back for just a second and talk about digital storytelling. My interest is not in horror. I'm not a big fan of the horror genre. I didn't actually see it until I was an adult, which is why I still think clowns are funny. But I actually think it is hilarious when I watch it too. But I grew up in North Carolina, and a lot of my family lived in the mountains of North Carolina or in West Tennessee. All these places were sites of front porch storytelling. Storytelling is rich in the Southern tradition. And there were places for storytelling. When I was a kid, there were still these places in these old houses, porches, kitchens, places in towns where people got together to swap stories. But that was not the case for our culture overall. There had been some changes happening in post-war culture. For instance, we moved out to the suburbs, meaning that we were commuting a lot more, and the front porches on our houses were sacrificed to have space for garages and yards, because our houses and suburb units were closer to the road. So we lost the front porch as an architectural item houses. So we used to go out after dinner every night and walk around in the cool air, from neighbor's house to neighbor's house to meet with other people, and the porches were a side of that. But we also got air conditioning in homes starting around the 1950s. And so we didn't need to go out to beat the heat from cooking dinner anymore. We could stay in. And the biggest thing, though, is that what we did when we stayed in was we watched television. Television started to be in more and more homes until through the 60s and 70s we started seeing the majority of homes. And television became, as John Fisk says, the bard of the 20th century. That replaced our own storytelling. Instead of sitting around looking at each other and swapping stories, now we have brought the storytelling device in our homes and turned all of our chairs toward it and sort of watched, mostly passively as we took in those stories. Now the thing with television is that it is a mass medium, meaning that the stories that it tells have to hit as many people as possible for them to sell the advertisements that go along with that. And so our storytelling becomes a national level of storytelling that tries to hit the broadest audience possible. It's not possible for us to sort of localize our stories anymore. The folklorist Richard Bogeyman says that these sorts of mass media storytelling inventions can never be folkloric for three reasons. One is they're not variable. Right? So once the television show is recorded for the most part, it is broadcast out, and that is the story that we get. The second is that they're not performed, meaning that they don't take place in the presence of an audience, and there's not a context of storytelling that goes on there. They're pre-recorded and broadcast, and the moment that we receive them, if we're not in a live studio audience at the time, we don't have a connection with the storytelling moment. The third is they're not collective. We don't build communities around these stories in the same way that we had the stories of folklore. And it gets to the point that we have ceded so much control of our storytelling and also a lot of our culture to television and to the mass media that we get a situation where Clay Shirky says that when we get to the age of the internet, we get to the age of interactivity and Web 2.0 and all of these digital affordances, we have to come up with the term participatory culture to describe something that before the age of mass media had just been culture. And we set this aside as an other thing, but really it should be the natural order of things. And so we wanted to look at the internet as a folkloric space, and we're certainly not the first people to do that. Trevor Blank, for instance, we invented the term digital campfire here. But I did draw a little bit on Jacob Podler's studies of the Melungeons, this concept of the internet as the entire internet as an electronic front porch in which we're able to swap information in a sort of free mass media way. Well, we wanted to look at the digital campfire as a specific thing. So in our book, we draw upon the open source movement with a shared collaboration, shared ownership, and continuous development. Those sorts of aspects of the open source movement that influenced especially the early creation of the Slender Man. But we also wanted to draw attention to the fact that these sorts of things that we attributed to the digital are actually the way that scary stories have always been told. Right? So passed from person to person with embellishment of details and told for the specific context of that telling. And so we conceived of the idea of the digital campfire as an online arena where users gather for the specific purpose of swapping stories. That's the whole reason we're there. We've gathered, like a campfire, to meet there to tell stories. And we do this with the awareness of the presence of an audience, the potential for recursive feedback from that audience, an eye toward pleasing the audience who is then present at the moment, and not some sort of audience in perpetuity. The potential to change the story depending upon what that audience tastes are and what the teller's tastes are and how those things all work together. An expectation that all may participate in the telling, so if I tell my story, then we're in a circle here, and it can be your turn next if you have a story to tell. And the idea that community bonds are forged and reinforced through the telling of these stories. The stories are important to the lifeblood and the mortar that holds together the community. And so from Bauman, we take these three ideas. Variability, which is the ability of a teller to modify details or the manner of telling of the story to fit the context of the situation, which leads to different iterations of stories. The idea of performance, which is a identifying storytelling as an event where the teller tells a tale in a space permitting mutual interaction with the audience, and collectivity, the communal creation of these stories, of these myths that take place over time and influence the nature of the community. And so variability in Slender Man, we've kind of already seen this through the early creative process. Across multiple tellings, we start to see differences come about depending upon the audience that tells those stories. And so one of the things that variability depends upon, the corollary to that, is repetition. And so we look to Vladimir Krop and typing the folk tales, the morphology of the folk tale, and seeing what formulaic things are sort of carried over from story to story. So instead of, for instance, where Krop might start a function of a story by saying, a young man leaves home to seek his fortune, here we see a function of a specific kind of Slender Man story as a young man turns the camera on himself. And so we can see sort of a correlation of these functions that are carried out. But the real interesting part is where we start to see those vary. And that variation comes from the specific digital campfire that these stories are told around, depending upon the audience that is gathered there. And so we see, for instance, the aesthetics change from something awful, which was older folks than the people who created Marble Hornets. And so you can see the difference between Slender Man going after children in a forum populated by some older folks that started the tales, to college film, where he starts to go after college students, film students. And we see the addition of things like slender sickness, which is a visual method of showing that the Slender Man is there, the audio-visual interruptions that come about, because that's the venue in which we're telling those stories. And so the variations come as a result of the campfire that they're told around. And so everybody who encounters these stories, though, is a potential teller. And so everybody has the potential to introduce their own variations of the Slender Man. And so by now, years after the initial creation, we see a wide spectrum of people telling different stories with different variations that Shira alluded to in our presentation. The second is performance, which is the co-presence of a storyteller and the audience, such that the audience influences the telling of that story. In the age of the digital, we call that interactivity, the ability of the audience to speak back to the creators of materials. And we see this taking place in the Slender Man stories through the affordances of what we call the Web 2.0, blogs and comment sections and web forums and places where people get together to converse. Stories that are told in this era are made with the expectation that people will be speaking back to you, that you will be in communication with your readers or your viewers, depending on what medium you're communicating with. And the creators of these Slender Man stories are taking that into account, and they're incorporating the communications of their audience into their stories. For instance, the creators of Everyman Hybrid, you guys saw some images from them, would hold Ustream sessions in which they would live broadcast some of their story and interact via the chat with viewers of the show, who would communicate with them in a sort of diegetic manner, as though they were in the story too. And those communications via those chats influenced later video installments of the Everyman Hybrid story. There was an early blog called Just Another Fool that told the story of numerous people actually who were studying drawings that led to the Slender Man coming around. And in the comment section of that blog, there were people would come and influence the story, and the author of the story would speak in character to the people who would comment. Their comments there would lead to the story being changed, and later, actually, one of the commenters that I believe was set up by the original author became the author of the blog after the original author disappears. In the final installment for that blog, after the final character to take over authorship finds the body of the first one and gets on a motorcycle and leaves, never to be heard from again, the comments are still ongoing there. And there are over 600 comments of people sort of carrying on the story or stepping onto the empty stage. Some people telling their own stories just in a few paragraphs there, some people directing links to other sites, some people still attempting to interact with the initial story that took place. And we also have an interesting iteration called the tutorial. which an author named In, instead of writing a story, a traditional Slender Man story where the Slender Man is stalking someone, writes instead a tutorial for avoiding Slender Man, how to get away from the Slender Man, providing rules such as always stay above the third floor of the building, and Slender Man hates heights or something. And so people reading the tutorial became quite popular in some communities. People reading the tutorial would take the advice from the tutorial and bring it into the comment sections of other people's stories to say, oh, you're being stalked by the Slender Man. Have you seen this thing called the tutorial? Here's how you get away from it. And you can imagine, as a teller, this disruption from the audience telling you, so you're telling a scary story, but here's a way for it to not be so scary for you. Just stay above the third floor, you'll be fine. And so these authors are having to sort of interact with the audience here and make decisions. How much do you respond to the audience giving you this advice? How does that disrupt your story? How do you incorporate it? And each author that faced that sort of dealt with it to different degrees. Sometimes it became known as a process called game jacking, where people would attempt to sort of Mary Sue themselves in as hero characters in other people's stories. And that became sort of verboten in the community, or in the many communities that we saw pop up there, were sort of unspoken rules about attempts by audience members to fully take over the stories of other people. So what we generally think of as the Slender Man writing community is actually made up of smaller communities. And so we see communities popping up at the original Something Awful forum. We see the YouTube groups come together, and that sort of community. We see a forum called Slender Nation that comes about. We see Slender Man stories being shared at the site Unfiction, which is for alternate reality games. We see a subreddit on the site Reddit created to tell Slender Man stories. And Shira will tell you a little later about fanfiction.net, where we see an entirely different set of stories told by an entirely different community. And these are sort of based around the campfires, right? So it's not that it's one large homogenous group all telling stories, but that is where at each site we have a different audience, we have a different context, we have a different situation in which that story is told. And that's kind of what we're looking at in this, is not looking so much at the Slender Man as a text, but looking at the context of its telling. Because it would be easy for us to look through these and say, that's a horrible story, that's a horrible story, that's a horrible story. But we can't judge these narratives logically, because they were written, or they were told in their various media for the communities and for the audiences that were there at the time of their telling. And as Jane Murray says, she says, it may seem trite-derivative to an outsider that these stories can be riveting and emotionally resonant for the participants. So as outsiders at the end, you might say, that's, you're a lousy writer. But for the people who were there at the time, they were emotionally invested in it. It means something entirely different to them. So these communities became fiercely protective of stories. And you see in several places on each forum when the potential for a Slender Man Hollywood movie to come out to sort of take the Slender Man from these folk practices and make it into a mass media intellectual property. They're very resistant to that because they don't want the agency to tell these stories to be taken from them, but they also really don't want the centerpiece of their community to be lifted out of their community and redistributed to everyone. So that they're fiercely protective of those.
So, as Eric was implying, as the Slender Man migrated across the internet, he found different digital campfires, and each of these migrations happen in very distinct ways, and so meaning becomes very associated with space and place online, and again, as Eric just said, context. So he started appearing on the website Creepypasta. Creepypasta came from, it was born out of the 4chan/X. Do you guys know 4chan? Okay, so 4chan, the blessing and curse of 4chan is that basically, as soon as something's posted on 4chan, if it is not, if nobody pays any attention to it, it's the short version, it disappears, right? Like everything is anonymous, or everything has the ability to be anonymous, and that anonymity means that once it's posted, if nobody likes it and it doesn't do anything, then it basically just fizzles into the ether, right? And so that's both good and bad. That means that things are constantly cycling through. That's where 4chan is where all of the early cat memes came from. For those of you that don't know 4chan, that maybe is one claim to fame at this point. That and a lot of hate rhetoric. but which is what it is. But the problem, of course, with things cycling out like that is that the stories get lost, right? And so /X was a forum meant for scary stories, and all of the scary stories kept getting lost. And so the idea was, well, we need a repository for all of those scary stories. So creepypasta. So pasta is a something that has been cut and pasted so many times online that it loses its authorship and context, right? Like it's just something that has become sort of a myth that belongs to the internet. So a creepypasta is something that is scary, that has done those things in a scary story. So it became this larger catalog for scary stories that have been told online, and Slender Man became one of those scary stories that ended up on creepypasta. And so creepypasta, in many ways, became this youth-based cultural anxiety, very youth-based thing. The Slender Man was sort of, you can see in this picture, kind of the patriarch of the clan of fictional creepypasta characters that were often referenced on here. Those characters are often referred to as pastas. And so it included Jeff the Killer, Ben, Jane the Killer, Tiki Toby, a whole bunch of other ones. I can't name everyone in that photo, just to be clear. Like I can't keep track of all of them. But there are a bunch of them that just that sort of those who are really into that culture can call it out. One of the more well-known ones was Jeff the Killer, and it's not a good story. I'll tell you right now. Jeff the Killer, it's a very well-known story, but it's about a bully kid that turns into a serial killer. That's all you need to know. It's a young boy bullied a bunch, turns into a serial killer, and that's the story. But they love that, right? Like that was a really popular story within that culture. But as creepypasta became overrun with stories of two things happened, it became all about standards, because as you can see up here, this is an example of what is referred to as crappypasta. Crappypasta is creepypasta that is written really badly, makes no sense, has spelling errors, grammatical errors, and it is completely unfeasible. So and this is actually the example of crappypasta, in that whenever you tell a bad horror story now online, the call and response answer is always, then who was voted, right? Like that is how you respond to bad storytelling in that place. And but also another thing started happening. Creepypasta stopped accepting fiction about Slender Man, about Jeff the Killer, and all the other ones, because they were getting really, really, really bad. And so they just said, okay, we're done here, no more. But then there are all these people that want to tell these stories, and they have nowhere to tell the stories to. So they went where everybody tells stories, where they don't know where else to tell a story, fan fiction went. And so there was this migration where suddenly everybody starts telling the stories on fanfiction.net. But what's weird is that there's no place on fanfiction.net for web series. There's nothing there for it. If you look at all the categories and all of the forums, there's just nothing there. But you can do fiction over games. And so people started posting under the Slender game in fanfiction.net for all of the creepypastas, which is sort of kind of crazy, and this crazy weird thing that just started to happen. And if you look under there, it's like stories and stories and poems and all kinds of things about all of the kind of creepypasta characters, primarily Slender Man, but you get a lot of Jeff the Killer in there too, you get a whole bunch of them. And it developed in this very organic way. And because of that, there are no standards on fanfiction.net. Anyone can post anything at any time. And so you get even more crappypasta. So this is one that I found at one point, which is Slendy, why you don't kill Justin Bieber. I don't need to read the story. I don't need to tell you anything else. That is the story. To me, that is pretty phenomenal. And what's great is that in the comment, he or she ends it with, "I'm sorry, please don't blame me on this. I just didn't have any better ideas." So you gotta respect the honesty of that, right? And a lot of the stories start to insist that the Slender Man actually might just be misunderstood. We might not really understand what's going on here. And there are an increasing number of stories that that imply that the Slender Man was being bullied. You get a lot of bullying stories because think about the audience, right? Like if it's a younger audience, that's something that's on their minds. And so these stories were happening in parallel to the web series that we talked about earlier. Like there were these two tracks that major campfires, right, that were happening in parallel, kind of, not like these people understood that the web series were out and they were responding to the web series, but the web series people had no idea that this was going on. And so you start getting a lot of stories, artwork, and everything that takes on this very patriarchal tone or a romantic tone. So as an example of that kind of artwork, and it makes sense in a lot of ways, right? Because the facelessness of the character means that you can superimpose anyone onto that face, right? I can't think of a more appropriate partner for, or love interest for a 14-year-old than a faceless person, right? Like that makes tons of sense when you start to think of it that way. And here's another example. People all know Slender Man. This is why I'm not allowed to drink wine and then go on Etsy. This Slender Man Valentine that I ordered one night. I actually am very pleased that I bought it, frankly. But I was told I'm not allowed to do it anymore. And so like, here's another example. I love this. I just found this recently in the Holy Romance. And also other pastas. So this is fan art, but I've done some stories that was Slender Man / with Jeff the Killer, wherein they together they have a romance and adopt a puppy and then bottle feed the puppy. Certainly not what was intended when you start with not where we started with Victor Surge, right? This is a completely different thing going on here. And again, not everyone knows that this is going on. And then of course you get stories that bring the Slender siblings in, but the parody becomes subsumed into the stories, and so the Slender siblings become actual characters. They're no longer parody. They're suddenly a part of the story, and it's easy to discredit this kind of fan fiction, except that's a problem because there's no canon. The canon for the story is 2 paragraphs and 2 photos. One does not get more legitimacy than another. And so now at this point, we're turning back to the stories that the girls told. The so-called mansion. Where did that come from? Well, in looking around FanFiction.net, eventually you can come across a story that was very well read and well loved on FanFiction.net called Cold and Dark. And it's a story about a young blind girl who wanders into the woods, and Slender Man gives her back her sight and allows her to live in exchange for her moving to his mansion and becoming his proxy. A story that I should add was written by a teen girl, and I actually do know that that's true if you read about methods. So we can't be dismissive or delegitimize one form of fandom over another. They're all important. It's not that this is less important than Marble Hornets, but it's complicated, it's messy. There's no full canon to any kind of online mythology, so none of it is legitimate, and all of it is legitimate. And there's a lot of people that have written about the gendering of fandom, whereas fan works that are done by women and girls tend to be discredited in more than sort of masculine modes of fandom, and that's been documented by many people at this point. I won't rehash all of that, but it's certainly worth thinking about in this case because there is a gendering of the legitimacy of the fandom. So we've been asked throughout this process, and we're going to wrap up, but is Slender Man dangerous? Is he real? And the reality is that the girls believe that Slender Man is real, and the news stories treated Slender Man like he was real. There's a theory. There's a popular theory of the Slender Man called the Tulpa theory, and it's based around this Tibetan concept, which was an Eastern concept, the Tulpa, that was sort of appropriated and brought into Western concepts by Alexander David Neal in the 1920s. And the idea of the tulpa is it's a thought form come to life. It's like an imaginary friend that if you breathe enough life into it, if you put magic towards it, it will come to life. But the problem with the tulpa is once it comes to life, you lose control. And so many people have theorized that the Slender Man wasn't real, but then so many people on the internet believed in it that it came to life, and now it has gotten out of control. And we really like to think of the Slender Man as a tulpa, because it allows for a space where he gets to both exist and not exist simultaneously. Because of all these people are believing in him, and people have committed crimes on his behalf, and people are writing news stories treating him that he's real, that he must exist in some way. It doesn't matter if he's actually real. The newscasters, everyone involved have basically contributed to this tulpa effect. And so the tulpa, we argue, is an effect of transmedia storytelling, where a story is all around us and it encompasses us. And the story itself wants to be real, and because of that, it really becomes very real. Our audiences are increasingly craving that kind of alternate reality in terms of these story worlds. And we seem to want our tulpas to be real and to that effect be a little bit out of control. Eric, I want to briefly talk about writing the book, and then we'll open it to questions and inquiries.
Yeah. So we knew that there was some interest in how we went about writing the book and what our experience with Copyright Pivot was. And so we wanted to just briefly sort of talk about that in a little more informal manner. I put together this timeline of us actually writing the book, and it sort of started in the stabbings occurred in late May. It wasn't until around the first week of June that, because of this strange confession they elicited from these girls, that the story sort of went national because of that weird, unusual element to it. And so Shira had published an article on open sourcing horror that was highly cited, and it was on Wikipedia. I had published my dissertation had a chapter on Slender Man, so I was one of the top hits and guru scholar for Slender Man. So we both started getting interview requests from different folks. And so we've done some of these interviews, and it's kind of funny. We didn't actually figure this out until this morning, but I was talking to my wife about planning to pitch the idea of co-authoring a book with Shira, and then Shira called me that afternoon and pitched the idea to me. And we've both been working up to how are we gonna convince the other person to do this. So when she called me, I was like, yes, we're on board with this. And Shira had a contact with an editor at Palgrave, and so we had an initial discussion with Palgrave.
It went something like, she contacted me and said, are you interested in publishing X book with me? And I was like, can I interest you in a Slender Man book? And she said yes. And I said, well, let me get back to you.
And we really wanted to gear toward the pivot line because we had a fear, because of all the fear mongering that was still going on at the time that we were having these conversations, that someone would beat us to it, which in academia you never want to deal with, and that they would continue the fear mongering. And we had sort of worked with this material so much that we had come to really appreciate the efforts of the people who had gone to. I mean, you've seen some of the storytelling ethics are amateurs, but there's a lot of work and a lot of love and a lot of learning. That's another thing that we covered in the book that we really impressed presentation, the amount of learning that takes place through this process of storytelling. And we sort of wanted to make sure that was represented. And so we did a draft of chapter outlines the next day, and then we sent a book proposal to cover it. And I think that was 2 chapters and an abstract for the full book. And we heard back from them. We got a peer review of the proposal by the end of that month and approval by the board 2 days later after that. And then by July 31st, which is only 2 months after this initial event that's the impetus for this taking place, we were contracted with them. And then less than 2 weeks later, we had
been writing it all.
Yes,
it's not like we.
No, it wasn't those 2 weeks, but it was a very frenzied time of writing. We made use of Dropbox. We used the Microsoft Word. I went back and looked at our actual draft recently, and we used the comments that you get with track changes to have these long conversations about how to approach the material. We weren't. We used some sorts of messaging, but most of our dialogue about the actual book took place in the marginalia of our manuscript. So we had to face issues like one of the early things that we had to do was do we name the girls, because their names they were being tried as adults, and so we actually decided not to. But there were lots of issues like that. What do we cover? What do we leave out? Is this your area to write about, or is it mine? Or how do we split the duties on this? So what we wound up doing a lot of times was alternating chapters. So Shira would be working on a chapter, I would be working on a chapter, and then we would trade them back and forth with edits and suggestions and comments. And then each one of our chapters went through about 8 drafts of us bouncing them back and forth. And so on August 15th, we submitted. It
was one of the most collaborative and also one of the most functional writing experiences I've ever. Certainly, like genuinely, it was one of the best co-writing experiences I've ever had doing it in that speed. And also because it was over sort of break, so you were able to just put everything into it.
Yeah, although I think we both had times when we were on the road, and like we had a conference call, and I was driving through like the hills of Gettysburg while we were talking about this horrific stuff. But we did definitely want to make sure that we got the manuscript submitted before the start of fall semester. So you see, our August 15th date, that was a date that we had set for ourselves, because if we went beyond that, we would get into course planning, prep, and this semester. And so from June 17th to August 15th, we went from talking about what we should be writing a book to having had the book written. So it was that rapid of a pace. And then we got a positive peer review back after our minor revisions were submitted, and then the book was released actually in print form first. We had expected it to be digital first, but it was print form first in December. And so 6 months from this thing happening in our initial conversation to actually having a book in hand. So that was an interesting process to go through. We wanted to share that at least a little bit with you in case you had questions that you wanted to ask about that. So I think that's where we want to wrap up today, and just open up to see what questions you all have. If
I'll start with your co-publishing. What would you do differently?
I would do it. I honestly, as I said, that was one of the best co-authoring processes I've ever had.
I will say that the one hitch that we ran into was that our editor actually left.
Yeah, that's always happens.
And that was beyond our control. So there was a little hitch there. That was really the only trouble that we ran into.
And was your writing repurposed material that you've been working on for a while?
2 chapters. 2 chapters were I had published 1 article, and Eric had 1 chapter from his dissertation. So we took 2 chapters that were from already existing material. We had written 2 other chapters for the introduction. So it was, what we did was, Eric wrote the introduction to the book, first draft, and I wrote chapter 1, first draft, that's what it was. And we didn't bother sending the other thing. I think we just did those 2, and then wrote the proposal. So it was the 3 chapters.
Yeah, but we did do a lot of the editing on as much editing on those chapters as we.
Right, but then by the time once that was done, and then we had just immediately started jumping into the rest of it, but we already had, Eric went to work on the thing that he had, the part for his dissertation, the Campfire chapter. I worked on massaging the thing that had been previously published, and then we only really had 2.5 chapters left to write. So, I mean, it's just a question of we went just really fast.
And one of the interesting things I think, and I don't know if anyone here has read the book, but through those edits, we sort of had to work back toward a voice that was not Shira's and a voice that was not mine, but one that was kind of in between ours. And I think we sort of worked that out.
A friend of mine recently, I gave her a copy of the book, and she said, I can tell which parts are yours. I'm like, I'm positive that you can't. And she said, well, was this yours? And I said, no.
Yeah.
Whatever it was, I don't even remember what it was, I think.
And I don't think that's something that we were very conscious of at the time, but it was something that we just sort of naturally worked toward as we wrote and passed these things back and forth. I don't know if it's a neutral voice but it's definitely, I read a chapter.
Our voices are somewhat similar.
Yeah, and I think that was helpful too.
Now I have a Slender Man question.
Okay.
As you're sort of observing the evolution of the story and the form a story like this takes, how do you sort of manage your observation? Like, what are your strategies for finding it, thinking about it, and separating yourself objectively from engaging in the story? Does that make sense?
We both, I think, at some point talked about the fact that we should write Slender Man fiction at some point after it, and we never actually did.
Yeah.
Although
there is an Easter egg in the index.
There are a couple of Easter eggs. We got a little goofy by the index, and we added a few things in that maybe we shouldn't have. We were so sure they were going to catch us, and go figure. So I think one of them was, if you were reading this, he's already found me. Yeah. Something like that. And Eric's like, put it in. I'm like, I'm not putting that in. We're going to get in trouble. He's like, no, just try it. And totally got that through. But one of the things we were talking about this morning was chapter 5, which is the chapter on fandom that really, we didn't know when we started writing this book, we actually didn't know what it was the girls were talking about.
And I think this is, so one of the things is we had written this work, and it's not really in the wheelhouse of the research that we normally do. And so we had both taken a little time off from actively pursuing everything that was going on. And so when we came back to it, this is when we sort of found this.
Right. We came back to it, and the running deal we had was that Eric had to read all of the Julie Kristeva, and I had to read all of that Slender Man poetry. That was sort of, I
don't know who got the worst of the best.
But we didn't know what had happened. We didn't actually know about that mansion story until suddenly we were going through. One day I was like, okay, it's time for me to deal with fanfiction.net. Like, I've been putting this off, and I started going through it. And at some point in that process, I found the story, and I remember sending it to you and saying, I think this is what they must have read, and then seeing the popularity of it and that other things were built off of it. It was very jarring. To realize that must have been what happened, and the fact that everybody kept it in the news stories, kept attributing it to a bunch of adults writing stories that children were misinterpreting when it was clearly a child, a teenager who wrote the story. I had very minimal contact with her because I wanted to make sure it was okay that I quoted the story in the book.
And that was another ethical discussion that we had.
That was a very difficult, and we didn't contact everyone, but we contacted that one person because we were just like,
We didn't want to, because the media was already attributing the stabbings to this general population of stories, we didn't want to give them, oh no, here's the one.
Exactly. We were very, and we didn't give her name or anything like that, but she is a high schooler. And it reads like a high schooler's story. It doesn't read like something that's threatening. It reads like somebody who's figuring out their stuff. And one of the things that we felt was really important about all of this was there's so much happening in the media right now that's talking about the bad that's come from Slender Man. But this story, this 2 paragraphs and 2 photos, has young people writing. And
And not
I
only
know.
writing and making animation.
right, like, I mean, like, the amount of material, the sheer volume of what has come from this is astounding. And, you know, can we really say that this is a bad thing if it's getting kids to write and read? I personally, I can't. I mean, it's violent, but no more violent than fairy tales. It's not inherently violent. The Slender Man is faceless. It's only as violent as you put into it.
Did you ever think about or try to reach out to the girls? Or their families?
Well, they're highly under lock and key right now. They're being, and I know people who have interviewed the families for people that were associated with in various, you know, modes of media right now.
I was on 2020 to
Yeah.
talk about the story, and to this point, the victim's family had not talked to anyone, and it was my understanding the producer had told me the day before, we've not had an opportunity to talk to the victim, live, just, I think, straight up live to. So I get down, and I have like an hour-long interview with the producer beforehand, and then David Moore comes on to talk to me, and his very first question is, we've spoken to the victim. What would you tell her about the Slender Man story? I was like, this is how we're going to do this.
He only used like 15 seconds of video and then a lot of footage of the victim playing the kittens. I'm not going to make that up. In the end, it was a lot of footage of the recovered girl playing with kittens. And, you know, I guess she seems very sweet. You know,
Which is good.
it must be terrible to recover from this on a lot of levels. But it certainly didn't have anything to do with the Slender Man, in my. The story I always like to tell is that when I was in high school, I remember there was a dude that I knew that would not go by any name other than Lestat. To a point that at one point he was pulled over by police officers and for probably writing his lights off or whatever, you know, and he refused to give his real name. He would only say that he goes by Lestat. I mean, kids do this. They get obsessed with media and they get a little emotionally involved or very emotionally involved sometimes. And that's not to, you know, that's not to say that the media itself did that.
It is also hard though to not, because I think we do have the urge to write some of those stories, because I think we read so many bad ones that we're like, no, this is how you should be telling the stories.
So it seems like from your question at the beginning that a lot of us came to the Slender Man story after this happened. How did you all find this story?
My husband.
Her husband.
Was beef cream?
It was marble hornets. He found marble hornets and he came to me and he was like, I found this thing. I think it might be an energy. I don't know what it is. And so we started watching it and then we went to Eric and we were like, basically it was something to the, I think we said something to the effect of, I can't do my dissertation on this. I already have a dissertation topic. Please go write about this.
Yeah. And I was doing studies of alternate reality games at the time. So, but it turned out to not really like sort of have some of the aesthetics of it. But and that gets back to they everybody for each community that they were creating for really used the aesthetics and expectations of that community. So they really captured the unfiction crowd by placing these clues and having different accounts. And so one of the interesting things about that one that made it especially artish was there was the main Marble Hornets account, and then there was a separate account, the To the Ark account, that commented on the first one that was also
and
there.
making videos. So they had like a response. They played a little bit with transmedia within what they did. They did sort of. They had some Twitter accounts that played off of the YouTube account, but it was not tons of depth to it.
But it wasn't like they were just putting out like a film. It wasn't a serial film, really.
Right.
It was more involved.
And they responded to their people at times. Not a lot, but a little. Thank you for coming.
Yes. Yeah. Any other questions?
What kind of comments do you hear when you do that? What you would expect, like a pandemic thing, or are they trying to
Well, I should start by saying that when we, it is not open source. In the beginning, Natalie said it was open source, and it is not. And that's something that, honestly, if I had one regret about all of this, I wish we had chopped it a little bit to different publishers, because frankly, it pisses me off that it's $65. I feel like that's not okay, and I think that there are people that would enjoy this book, and that it would do well in pop crowds. We had 2 rounds of reviews from different people. The first round was somebody who really didn't understand what it was.
I think they actually liked the book. They didn't understand the pivot format was what it was. They said this is short and could be a much longer study and spend some more time on it, or something like that.
It was sort of, and they.
It was to the point that our editor apologized to us that this was the review that had come in, and we had no problems getting the board approval as a result.
And then the second set was fairly minor, but one of the beautiful things about co-authoring like this was that we really edited each other so dramatically. Like I wish, right now I'm writing another book and I'm writing on my own, and I wish that Eric lived in my head and could edit like.
Glad I don't.
But like that made for the most efficient writing process, right? Because you're just like constantly tossing back and forth. I think that there are issues in terms of the academic publishing at this point where, having to make choices between university presses versus popular, or not popular, but like the semi-university presses that know that we need books, to do well, but at the same time, it's, that they're able to charge a lot for those books. That's a problem. I think that, of course you're always given the option to publish open source, but you have to pay $10,000 for that. And that's, I think.
And that's an overall battle that all academic publishers and all academic
university presses will charge less for books, and that's the thing. I mean, it's a faster process with that. So we made a choice basically where we decided to go with who we went with, in part because we knew we could get it out very rapidly, and that was what was important to us at that moment.
And on their part, they did their best to meet those deadlines as well. So they were really quick with responses, really quick with our edits going through and sending those back to us. So it was good. It was a very good process with that tour.
Yeah, it really was. I agree. Except for when we had a new editor.
That was
almost immediately after sending our manuscript in, they're like, oh, by the way, good luck, and I'm sure you'll like your new editor.
What are you each working on now?
I'm writing a book. I have a contract with the University of Minnesota, so we're trying the other side of this equation on games. I'm analyzing games that are designed for women audiences.
And I don't have a book in the works right now because I just had a baby, and I'm doing conferences this year because I didn't do.
To be fair, it's my baby.
Yeah, sorry.
You're welcome here.
I was there for the process. But Shira and I have also talked about working in the future about sort of extending this and doing a longer study of general online art.
One of our projects that we've talked about, the next time we can kind of do something is along the book on the aesthetics of internet art, because it does seem to be sort of appearing aesthetic than other art.
How long have you been a fan of horror?
I never thought of myself as a fan of horror until I read this book, but so I can't tell you, only because I didn't realize how much I liked horror until I read this.
And I think that's one of the interesting things is I wasn't a fan of the horror genre, so I didn't like slasher movies, which were the horror movies of my youth. But the internet horror is interesting because one of the reasons it's popular. So there's a subreddit called No Sleep that's really interesting. You may have seen that one of the news reports that came out last year was a story about a guy whose his girlfriend had died, and yet there were posts on her Facebook wall stalking, is that the way it's set up? Facebook wall stalking them with photographs until the last one was a shot of his back posted to her page. And that was a horror story told about new media, right? And so one of the things we talk about in our book that we didn't get into here too is that there are a lot of things about Slender Man that reflects the anxieties of our time. So we talk a lot about selfies, growing into adulthood, because a lot of the early stories are about making that transition. The Slender Man is a coming of age story sort of thing. And so people are approaching horror differently in these spaces. And so I really enjoy these stories, but not so much the horror that was popular when I was a kid. So I think it's brought to me a newfound appreciation for what folks are doing.
And to that end, what I've always liked, the things I've always liked about horror has always been sort of how it can represent cultural anxieties. I just enjoy that kind of analysis. I like the way that horror works on the mythology. Thank you all for coming.
Well,
Thank you so much. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I just, I'm of the age bracket where I wouldn't even know where to begin to find this stuff.
I forgot to advance the last slide. If you have further questions about any of this for us or questions about publishing or anything, feel free to email.
I guess if you watch a YouTube video, then that could lead you to something. Like, I'm wondering, curious how a young person begins this exploration. Is it?
It's rabbit trails. It's just like, it's like you find one thing and you're like, huh. But all internet related research is like that. You know, I mean, I'm doing that same thing with video games at this point where I'm studying casual games that are made for women audiences. So whenever I play a game, I then pay attention to the next game that it tells me to play, and then the next game after that, and then I just let it push me around a little bit, and then you find things. The hardest part for this was finding the fan fiction kind of stuff, and I think that was just a resistance on my part because I think on some level I knew that going down that rabbit hole was going to be a big one, and I think I just kept putting it off, and then finally I was like, why didn't I do this before now?
And a lot of you find from people who are members of communities going to other communities to share what their community has done, and sort of being missionaries for the stories that they're telling there. And there are certain central places, like Slender Nation has a lot of links to these, although they do treat some as much more legitimate than others. But that's a place where we see a lot of interaction amongst those.
And part of the aesthetic of all of this is that people get in trouble when they break the fourth wall, right? Like you are expected in all of these internet horror spaces to play along, And they specifically say on one of the Slender Man subreddits, there's a rule in on the sidebar that basically is like, we know that he's not real. Stop telling us. It's okay. Stop, don't post on here and make fun of us. Don't post on here and say, I'm the Slender Man, because we know you're not the Slender Man.
There's a lot of spoilers.
Yeah, right, exactly. They're expecting that, and that does not amuse anyone.